has no name. I'm not just being facetious here. This is one of the main takeaways that I want from this presentation. I'll talk about a few technologies. And there's nothing special about me. I haven't gone to any special schools, haven't been on any special projects. And if I did it, anybody else can do it. You just need to apply yourself and read the documentation. So I work with a company. It's international. This will help a little bit better. So we have multiple sites. So these offices, they're all very, very small offices. And puts us in a little bit of a difficult situation because a lot of solutions out there think that you're working with larger companies. So just an example, the one in San Francisco is about 20 people. Connecticut is 30 people. Toronto is 20 people. So and even smaller. So we have about 20 servers across the globe, 390 phones, mostly are user desk phones and a few conference phones, 9 sites, and traffic isn't anything impressive for a lot of you. It's only 1,000 calls per day. But I am the only admin for voice and video across the globe, so my responsibilities start at Sunday, 8 o'clock, and finish when San Francisco goes to sleep. That's Friday night. We also keep everything in-house, no cloud, so that's quite unusual. The reason, so it's not that what we do is super secretive, but it's very privileged information, so just as a liability point of view, we keep it all in-house, so that we're finally always responsible for all the data that we have. So that's why we have an open source culture, and everything is heavily in-house, which is great because it gives me a lot of room to play for things like Asterisk. We used to have a huge mishmash of versions and installs, PBX and SIP, Trixbox and Elastic being the main ones. And also those phone systems were doing different roles. So they would have cards in them, they would act as the media gateway, they'd act as conference machines, and they would also act as a PBX. And because they're different pieces of software, some offices had some functionality, some offices had some other functionality. There's an example. This is one device we had in Bahrain. I installed it 9 years ago, and it kept on running on Trixbox to the day. So yeah, it made the Hall of Fame for running so long without ever causing any problems. But it's also a mark of shame because you should not run boxes for 9 years unupdated. So we really wanted to move away from this chaos. Again, because like I said, behaviors would vary from office to office. You're holding the devices back from upgrading because you don't want to upgrade certain pieces of software which might break the PBX. As I alluded to earlier, there's licensing constraints, so whatever solution that we were going to move towards needed to be sensitive to the fact that we're going to have a lot of installs, and that's just simply not a case because a lot of software is licensed per host, and you need redundancy, and I can't afford having 2 Windows machines in every office just to support 10 people making simple calls. And again, as you saw, we're not very traffic heavy, so it doesn't make economic sense to have something with such large overhead. And you also, with the pieces of software that I mentioned earlier, you have a lot of times you'd have the extension matching the actual account name, the SIP account. And of course, that's a bad thing because you have people trying to crack accounts. We don't suffer from that because none of our stuff is internet facing. But still, it's not to say that somebody could try to do that internally. So best practices, you look at the best practices filed in Asterisk, and it's out there. Secure passwords and proper device naming. So this is what we want to achieve. So we move to Asterisk. Asterisk is the way. The second main other takeaway I'd like to give from this presentation is that the reason I volunteered to do this in the first place is I wish I could see this presentation 3 years ago when I was thinking about moving everything to Asterisk. And the reason I say that is it looked really daunting. The idea of managing 20 servers where I'm actually managing all the configuration for all those servers and having to do it all manually just sounded really, really laborious, and you need to be efficient at work in your workplace. So I thought, okay, the Asterisk is great, but maybe it's not for me. I'm only trying this the first time. I can't really do this in production without, just experimenting in production. But after I'll show you some tricks that I've learned on the way. And had I known those beforehand, I would have been a lot more emboldened to just do it. So went to Huntsville for the Digium training. I don't want to brag, but I didn't really need the training because I had already learned a lot of the stuff that I needed to learn on my own. But I do work in a company where I'm the only one dealing with RTC, so I don't really get to talk to that many people. Going to the Digium training, I got to talk to a lot of people and build that confidence. And also it served as a refresher because they go through the whole repertoire of Asterisk, and it's good to do that in an immersive setting where, like, in a few days you're just looking at Asterisk. And from that, and part of the talk is the name. So part of the name of the talk is it's many-faced. In the sense, when you read this book, it's 846 pages. It's 3 pounds. We're talking about the new version, but they're talking about releasing a 5th edition. And I guarantee you the 5th edition is probably going to be even larger unless things are left out. It weighs 3 pounds. It's a big book. And because this is evidence of the project itself. There's so many people contributing to the project in so many different ways. So you can use it however you like. You don't even need to use it as PBX. And you hear these stories where people are using it for radio, not even as a PBX at all. So when you look at Asterisk, don't think of it as just a PBX. It's a huge set of things that you can do with it. So when we got those PBXs that we were talking about earlier, the Tricks box, the PBX and SIP, and so on and so forth, is trying to design the new platform for our systems. One thing I wanted to do is simplify it as much as possible. So part of that is splitting the roles of what the PBX is doing so that I can replace those parts a lot more easily and if I ever needed to. And also the maintenance of them becomes clearer from a documentation point of view. So I split them into 3. There's 3 main roles that those phone servers were doing. One is acting as a conference server or media server, acting as a PBX, and acting as a media gateway. So to solve the media gateway, that was very easy. Not recommending Pattern, they work great for me, but we use session border controllers that convert SIP to ISDN in the cases where we have ISDN lines, or just SIP to SIP in the case where we have SIP trunks. It's handy to have dedicated devices just doing that. You maintain the configuration, and they're also easy to maintain as far as firmware goes. Then the other part is the conference server. So I aggregated those because they inherently have a dependency on the links from the offices anyways. Those I put in our data centers, which are the blue points. And those are dedicated conferences servers sitting there. And I'm actually modestly proud about how dumb the conference servers have been kept. It's only 100 lines of dial plan. And very minimalist in design. So the way it works is that a participant will call the dedicated Asterisk conference server. And they have an option, just 2 options. They can dial into the conference using the conference code as you would normally do, or if you press start, you can create a conference. And one problem that I saw in the past was a lot of issues with the admin pin. And it seems just like an extra step for users, and we all know users hate passwords. So that was always a point of problems. So I thought, okay, how am I going to do this without using admin pins? The way I do that is I lock it to the caller ID. It's not the most secure thing to do, but it works for us. And what that means is when a person creates a conference code, only that person can ever change the conference code. And only a call with that matches that caller ID can do that. And that saved the conference code and settings, admin pin and recording setting, is saved in Asterisk DB. So whenever somebody joins that conference, that Asterisk is checking against the internal database what pin it should be using, and if it's recording. There's also a playback message that if it's a recorded conference, it will warn you. And they also have, pardon me. At the end of the call, you can also receive the recording, because that's a requested feature. And again, I wanted to keep it as simple as possible. No websites, no nothing. Because again, there's always users coming and ask what to do. So the less the users have to think, the better, in my opinion. So the way I achieve this is at the end of the call, it checks if that you are the last person on that call, and then it waits like 10 seconds, and it converts that recording that Asterisk drops in the recording folder, and it converts it to MP3. This is a Python AGI script which does this. Using, I think it's called libav right now. It's what used to be FFmpeg. It generates, when it copies that, it will copy that file to a Nginx web folder, and it makes a unique key, and it appends that to the file name. So that sort of makes it like a little bit of a secret. So you can't guess what the recording file's name is going to be. And then what it does, it goes off, it checks against LDAP to see who created that conference and finds out who's the user. And then I guess it checks against LDAP what's the email address for that user. And then it sends that person that link. So all that person has to do at the end of the call, they receive a link, they click on it, they can copy the recording. And then they're deleted after like 30 days. And the conferences themselves, they're use it or lose it. So if I see that in the database that there's a conference that's more than 6 months, it gets deleted. Now, we spoke about the gateway, we spoke about the conference server, now we can talk about the PBXs. And the first, I guess the core thing that the PBX is doing, it's managing its own network. So all the phones are on a dedicated network for the PBX. So it's acting as a DHCP server. And that, in doing so, it's preparing the phones for phone provisioning. And the way we do that is with if you're not familiar, with PhoneProv. And PhoneProv, I highly recommend it. It does miracles. And the way that's done is underneath the network definition in DHCP, you have all these different classes. So what that does is it will match the hardware prefix on the MAC address of the phone making the DHCP request, and it will customize the DHCP response to tell that phone where to pick up its configuration file. So in this case, it's /phoneprof/ the server /phoneprof/ SNOM320 in the case of SNOM320, and then different phones have different pages. Now, how does PhoneProv work? When you load the module, you can instruct it to make these dynamic files. So in this case, what we're telling the PhoneProv module here is whenever somebody comes up with this request, SNOM320- with Mac, depending on the device itself, it's going to go off and serve this file, which is in the PhoneProv directory. SNOM/320 Mac. And that's just a template. So when you load PhoneProv, let me see. Yeah, so that's what the template looks like. And you have, these are custom to, in the case of the SNOM phone, this is custom to SNOM. So this is how you configure a SNOM phone. And you don't have to create a file for every phone. You just create the template, and PhoneProv will dynamically create those files for you. So when the request comes in, it's already set up a custom configuration with the username and the secret. And those come from user.conf. So in Asterisk, you set up your users in users.conf. You say that account uses PhoneProv, and you tell it the MAC address. So when PhoneProv loads, it creates these files based on that template specifically for that phone. And of course, this saves a lot of work. And the beautiful thing about this is that, okay, you didn't configure one phone at one date, another phone at another date. They're all templated, so they're all the same. And that really helps with debugging, knowing going into a problem, knowing the behaviors of that phone and not having to guess or double check on them. The PBX is acting as a HTTP firmware server, so you have the option of setting static files. So I'm using the Asterisk HTTP server. It's very lightweight, and I'm putting the SNOM firmwares there. And again, this is super useful because not only are they configured the same, but they all have the same firmware. You get to keep the firmware up to date and so hopefully secure. And importantly, you have the same behaviors across your network. The PBX is acting as presence. Now, this was something that wasn't immediately super obvious to me at the time I was checking this, but this is actually a very, very simple concept. In your extension hints.conf, you instruct the presence server, the presence module. It's not a module, it's part of the SIP module. But you instruct it, if you get a subscribe for any of these extensions, what you really need to be looking at is the device state of this account. These are actually account names. So when somebody makes a request for 12024, it's mapping that to the device state of these accounts. Sorry. Queues. Again, another great feature of Asterisk is queues. I'm using this in a slightly perverse way because I'm actually using them as ring groups, which is not. I don't think that's the intended use, and I haven't seen that many examples out there like that. But as you can see, my account names are quite fairly long, and it was immediately obvious that it would be normally the way this is recommended is you put a dial command, and then you concatenate a bunch of accounts in the dial command. So like when you get a call for a certain extension, the instruction for the PBX is to go off and dial all these accounts. And you're supposed to concatenate them with ampersand. But that becomes extremely unmanageable, and it's impossible to not make a mistake because the ampersands are really easy to lose. So the neatest way I found to get around this problem is to create queues. And this looks to me, it looks a lot neater. One of the ways you can use queues is just to have a ring all. So, and I guess it paves the way for if we did want to have fancier behaviors with queues, then that could be easily done by just adding another queue. And moreover, the PBX is doing other things. It's acting as a fax client, it's doing call recording, and it's also RTP playback. So you got, there's the EcoTest application, which is very useful. We do get like a lot of problems from time to time where users complain about sound quality, and the first thing I tell them is I'll call the echo test, and then you can see if it's something from your phone or not. The other one is playback. So there's these recorded messages that you can call it, and you can test the device. It's a very easy way to test your device to see if there's a problem with the speaker of the phone or so on, or a network problem. And it's also acting as a music on hold server, of course. So even in my very, very simple implementation of a PBX, as you can see, the Asterisk is doing a lot, and that just barely touches the top of what Asterisk can actually do. To make my life easier, I set up a Python script, because as I shown you, you have, whenever you create an account, it could exist in queues. It might be a queue member. It needs the hints for the SIP notifications and subscribes to be added, and I keep the accounts under users' local hard phones. So there's a few areas where configuration needs to be updated. To save all the configuration, we use Mercurial. If you're not familiar with Mercurial, again, the new technology can sound daunting, but is unbelievably easy and very, very useful. So Mercurial is SVN where you can save your configuration, and you can see how it's changed over time. On a daily basis, I only use like 4 or 5 commands. Add remove. What add remove does is it checks your copy of the data set. It will add or remove files to your. It'll add or remove files. You can pull from the central repository, and you can commit. So that means like the changes that you've been working on, you're committing them to the repository, and then you push that to the database. And sometimes when there's conflicts, you merge. But there's really just those 4 things you need to know, and it's unbelievably useful. Now, again, talking about why I wish I had somebody give this talk to me earlier, is Ansible. If you're not familiar with Ansible, do get familiar with it. It makes life so much easier. I'll explain this now. We actually use Tower. So Tower is a paid solution that works with Ansible. I'm not going to talk about Tower just to not complicate things. It actually, because it's a bit extra work. But what it does, it makes things easier for you. So I'll show you how you can run things in Ansible, and then Tower just wraps it all nicely in a good website that you can give privileges to coworkers. So in my case, it doesn't always come down to me. If my coworkers want to make changes, they could go on to Tower and run Ansible commands from there. So I'm basically making the changes to the PBXs, but they have the option to make changes as well. Not to the code base, but at least to the servers. I'm going to try to explain Ansible. It's not, trust me, once you get the concept, it's really not hard at all. It's unbelievably useful. So I'll try to do my best here to explain it simply. But the way it works is it starts with the host file. So you have this one file called host, and in it there's just a list of host names. So you have server 1, server 2, server 3. And then there's the host variable, host vars file. You can assign custom variables to those hosts. So server 1 will have a certain set of variables for it. Server 2 will have another set, and I'll explain to you why that's useful. And then you have a inventory file, and in the inventory file, you allocate those hosts that you had defined to groups, to roles. So server 1, you can say, okay, server 1, 2, and 3, they're Asterisk servers. And then you can say the same set of servers, they're also PBXs. So you can tell it different roles. And if you want to install, for example, Nginx, you can have a role for Nginx, which means that certain tasks that you want to run on a web server will get executed. Now, this is what a role looks like. So in this case, we're looking at the very basic Asterisk install. So the conference servers and the PBXs, they have 2 roles. They're Asterisk servers, and then they're either conference servers. They can be conference servers, or they can be PBXs. In 1 or 2 cases, they have both roles. So they're Asterisk servers, PBXs, and conference servers. So I'm just looking here at the basic, what we do to Asterisk servers. And inside that role, you have typically you have 4 folders. The tasks, the templates, and the files. So the templates and the files are very similar, with the exception that files are basically configuration files that don't change. So when you instruct Ansible to execute that role, and you have a copy command, it's just going to copy that file as it is. It's not going to touch it. It's not going to do anything to it. In the case of templates, it's a little bit more fancy. That template will have variables defined in it. So just as an example, the mail configuration. So it's not an actual example from this role, but just as an example. You can imagine that each server has a different mail server. So as I said earlier, where you have the hosts and then the host variables, that's where I can instruct what mail server that host is going to use. And then when Ansible is instructed to push that configuration, that templated configuration, inside that template, I can have a reference to that variable that I said, okay, look up what mail server this server is, look up what mail server this Asterisk server is supposed to be using. So that's a way, again, so that's the use of the template, of course, is to have as little files as possible and having the same setup across as many across all the PBXs. The tasks is where you tell Ansible what to do. So I'll give you an example. So in the Asterisk role, under tasks, I have this simple task here, sysutils. So it's useful to have certain utilities on every Asterisk server. And this is how simple it looks. So basically, it's when Ansible runs this task, this is a name for the task. Tags, I'll get to that in a second. And we're running the apt command, so the aptitude command. And I'm telling it, okay, run these packages. So basically, I'm saying in state present. So that's how simple it is. You tell Ansible, hey, I want this aptitude package to exist. You say I want it to be present on all servers. So every time you run this play against that server, it's making sure that these are installed. Now, tags are useful because, as you can see, this is a setup script. Pardon me. So you can tag it as such. You can say, okay, this is part of the install. So when you going back, every role has several plays which have several tasks in them, and the usefulness of tagging them is that when we execute those tasks, we can say, skip the installs, or for example, I have bulky. In some cases, I'm pushing WAV files to those PBXs. I don't want to say doing that every time I have to touch a server. So a useful thing is to mark it as a bulky task, so that when I run those plays against those servers, we skip the bulky things. What are we doing? Time 1:30. So that, in a nutshell, that's Ansible. This makes everything really, really convenient. And deploying a server is so easy because now that I've done all now that I've templated all the configuration, if you want to roll out a new server, I get the facilities guys will say, okay, this has been prepped. You have, Ubuntu. It's vanilla. It's untouched. All I need to do is log on to the Ansible server, tell Ansible, okay, here's a new host, and here's the variables for that host. Go off and do your magic, and it will go off. It will install the Asterisk package. You'll make sure it's got all the configuration that it needs, and it's all the same across the board. And it's unbelievable. I mean, the thing is, so the way we've set it up, I'm only working with 8 servers, but I can imagine this can scale to 100, 200 servers easily, and maybe even more. So it's actually probably a little bit over-engineered in that sense, but it does make my life terribly easy. Just deploying a new server means I run the command, go have a coffee, come back to my desk, and boom, I can actually log onto the thing and do everything. So it's definitely a tool worth looking at. Now that we have a nice platform, we're also testing a lot with CP. It's another useful tool. When you deploy a new server, you want to make sure that you haven't got anything wrong. So it's useful to run a set of standard tests against that server just to make sure it can communicate with all the other servers as you would expect it to before the users report a problem. The way CP works is you can have just a scenario file, but there's also the option to use call lists. You can use a scenario file without actually having a call list. You can define the target that you want to call on the command line. But in this example, so the scenario files, they're a bit cumbersome in the sense that you actually have to write, so let me just go forward here. You have to write the entire scenario from scratch, and that's the whole SIP conversation, and you have to write the messages. An easy thing to do here is, what I like to do to emulate one of our phones, I'll just capture a conversation that the phone had, so an invite to another office. I'll capture that, copy paste it, and then modify that conversation, that SIP dialogue. And that's what the scenario is. Very simple. So invite, I send my first initial invite, and then I'm expecting a challenge. You can get a trying, a 100 message, a trying message. But eventually, we're supposed to get the challenge. We acknowledge that challenge, and then I re-invite with credentials, and then I'm supposed to get an OK. And in this case, I'm calling the 878, which spells out to TST. Those are the test extensions, the ones I told you where you get a playback. So I'm listening to the playback for 3 seconds. SIP doesn't do anything with the playback, but it's good to see that there's a healthy stream. And then I hang up, and I'm supposed to get a 200 for that hang up. So that's the scenario. That's what's defined in that scenario file. And I'm telling SIP to do this 9 times over at a rate of, I think it's 1 per second. And inf is where you're going to get your targets from. So that is basically this file, that simple. So these are all the targets that I want to run in this test case. The first line should be sequential. You need to instruct SIP how. You can get random or sequential. So you can pick out those targets at random, or you can do it sequentially. So these prefixes are different offices, but every office has the same test number, 878. So in one go, I get to see if I have a new server, I don't know, in Germany, then I get to make sure in one sweep that German PBX can actually talk to everybody in the network. And again, that's a very useful thing to know when you've deployed a server. This was just for fun, really. MRTG, we graph usage with MRTG. MRTG in general is a very, very useful tool. We use it for other things. I just did it pretty much because I can. So we use it to monitor UPSs and such, and you can also, there's a Perl script that I downloaded from the internet, and instead of doing SNMP checks, it's actually logging into with manager, AMI. So I have an AMI user on every PBX, which is restricted by IP, so that only the MRTG server can make these queries. So what that script does is it goes off, talks to the Asterisk server through AMI, and it just checks how many channels are running on that server. But it's a neat way to see how if things are being used. Homer, I said in the thing that we're actually using Homer was a bit of a lie because I thought by now we would have it running in production, but we don't. It's only in testing. It's a really good tool. This is actually from the website, not from mine. It's very simple. You have these capturing agents that you install on the PBX. There's 2 ways you can do it. PJ-SIP has a native one. So what that does is it sits on Asterisk, and all the SIP messages that the Asterisk server PJ-SIP is getting, it will report that to Homer. It's a 4-line configuration for Homer. It's very simple. You just say where you need to send those reports to. And it's really useful because, if somebody reports a problem on a call, you have to, the way it is for me right now, I have to log on to the Asterisk servers and check the logs and whatnot. By having all this centrally logged, you can have a view on every single conversation that's happened on your network. And what's even more useful is that not only that, you can click on the call, and you can see the RTP reports. So you can see how if there's been jitter, if there's been loss. And as you saw, our network is from one side of the globe to the other. Sometimes we run into network problems, and then it's a debate with the network guys. They go, I need to give them proof that there's problems. So this would be really, really useful for me to send them the RTP reports, and I can say, hey, look, between 11 and 10, there were problems reported on this call, but I can show you that for the rest of the day everything was fine. There may have been a problem on your end, and we've run into these problems in the past. And when I'm opening up a ticket with the network team, I like to give them facts. We're nearly done, right? Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So the future. Now that we have this nice platform and it's all the same, what are the next steps? A few things that I'd like to do is need to start looking at IPv6 and secure protocols. Were you at Camellia World? Okay, Ole Janssen, he really drove this point. It was early in the year. We're at Camellia World in Berlin. And Ole was ranting about, it's about time people start taking this stuff seriously. So I think I should follow his his command. REST in the dial plan, the conference servers that we use, that's just in the dial plan. I'd like to start playing around with REST, and one thing I'd really like to do is between the two conference servers, I'd like to have them to talk to each other so that I don't have to tell my users, hey, you created your conference in US, not in London, so make sure you're dialing the London server, the US server. Having them to talk to each other, then they can coordinate between themselves. Asterisk test suite, so Asterisk has a test suite apparently, and it does support SIP-P, so it'd be good to formalize that a little bit and get my SIP-P stuff into formal test suite. CG rates, which Dan is talking about just right now, you can rate calls for their cost. And what's really useful from that, another useful feature is that you can use that information to block people who are abusing your system, which is anti-fraud is something that I'm lacking in. Again, I think it's because we have an insular network. I get to get away with these things, but it's something that definitely needs to be done. Forking for fancy routing, we have Camaillo servers which deal with video, and I'd like to start forking some of the calls so that we can have dynamic routing for certain users, and just disk encryption. Again, because it's all in-house, we're not too stressed about things like that. So to wrap up, and I just want to say thanks to all the people who've contributed to Asterisk. I unfortunately can't code, or I don't code. So my way of saying thank you is to give this talk. I hope it's been useful, and maybe as useful as I found Asterisk itself.